It is my absolute pleasure to host today's event organized by the Council on Geostrategy, the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom as well as our free and open nations more united, stronger and greener. The face of war is changing. There's no longer a clearly defined distinction between active combat zones and the home front. New technology has brought new ways of attacking opponents and increased the cost of kinetic war, rendering any all-out war ruinous to any nations engaging in it. This has encouraged nations seeking to disrupt the free and open international order to use alternative means of combating competition. Hybrid war, gray zone warfare, unrestricted war. Today, traditional conflict fought with guns, bombs, and drones has become too expensive to wage, too unpopular at home, and too difficult to manage. In an age when America threatens Europe with sanctions and when China spends billions buying influence abroad, the world is heading for a new era of permanent low-level conflict, often unnoticed, undeclared, and unending. And today, the Council on Geostrategy is absolutely delighted to announce the launch of the new book written by our brilliant associate fellow, Professor Mark Galeotti, which is called The Weaponization of Everything, and which discusses the increasingly blurred lines between kinetic and non-kinetic military action in modern conflict, and how states can secure themselves against the novel challenges posed by its implications. And we have a fantastic opportunity to hear from our esteemed panelists, and we are joined tonight by Elizabeth Braw, Stewart Mcdonnell MP, and of course, Professor Mark Galeotti himself. So I would like to briefly introduce all our panelists now. Elizabeth Braw is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on defense against emerging national security challenges, such as hybrid and gray zone threats. Concurrently, she is a columnist with Foreign Policy, where she writes on national security and globalized economy. She is also a member of the UK National Preparedness Commission. Professor Mark Galeotti is the Director of MIAC Intelligence and an Associate Fellow at the Council on Geostrategy. He is an honorary professor in the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. And apart from being an expert in modern Russia, particularly in security, is an expert in modern Russia, particularly in its security, politics, and intelligence services. And finally, we are joined by Stewart Mcdonnell, MP, who has been a Member of Parliament for Glasgow South since 2015 and has been the defence spokesperson for the SNP in Westminster since June 2017. He is currently a member of a Foreign Affairs Select Committee and has been a member since 2020. He has a keen interest in disinformation as a tool of conflict, having published a report on disinformation in Scottish public life. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. Our panelists will speak for 7 to 10 minutes, and in the second half of our hour, we'll move to the Q&A session with the audience. Professor Mark Galeotti will start with his speech, followed by Stewart Mcdonnell and Elizabeth Braw. And finally, the event will end with the Q&A session. You can ask your questions during the whole course of the event, but please do make sure that you indicate your name, affiliation, and to whom you are addressing your question. So without any further delay, Professor Galeotti, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to present this in coordination with the Council on Geostrategy. It might sound strange, given that we are still at a point where, despite talk of the mildest of de-escalations, we'll have to wait and see, on the Ukrainian border, at a time when the Russians have amassed 150,000 troops, to be talking about a world in which actually kinetic conflict may well be becoming de-emphasized. But even that, I think actually one can present as an interesting case study. Putin has built up a military force which absolutely could roll into Ukraine very, very short notice, and if we're perfectly honest, could break the Ukrainian military on the battlefield. Taking the cities, pacifying the country, that's a totally different matter. But if we're talking about, as it were, conventional military overmatch, Putin has got it, and yet he's not deploying it. Instead, Ukraine is facing the full range of other kinds of covert and deniable instruments that states can use these days. Cyber attacks, political subversion, corruption, disinformation, essentially terrorism, the list goes on. Even for a regime such as Putin's Russia, actually overt military conflict is an option they would rather not use if they possibly could. And this is one of the essences of the book, which is basically that the world has changed, but people haven't. Warfare, as we've heard, has become ridiculously expensive, not just in sheer financial terms, but also in terms of the social and economic impacts. We're all interconnected, and therefore, while we wage war, in many ways, we are waging war upon our markets and our suppliers and our bankers and our debtors. Secondly, this very interdependence, which once upon a time we were told would actually end wars. Well, in a way it has. We all operate within a single economic bubble, within a single information space. And yet, actually, what's happened is this interdependence has actually become the battlefield. People have found ways precisely of using that against us. We don't have as many shooting wars as once we did. There are many, many civil wars still, often with interventions by other countries, but conventional old-style state-to-state wars are much more less likely. And in part, the third key development has been the end of the Cold War, which brought with it a certain kind of artificial stability, admittedly with the looming shadow of the mushroom cloud. But it was a stability which, well, it was peace of sorts. But if you were a Czechoslovak citizen, if you were a Hungarian citizen, it was peace bought at a pretty sort of high price. But also it was peace which in some ways, because the North exported its conflicts to the global South. The Cold War was much less cold if you were in Afghanistan or Angola, if you were in Vietnam or Cuba or Nicaragua. So what's happened now is we actually have a world in which conflict has become, the old style of conflict, shooting conflict, has become much, much less conceivable, much, much less useful. Taking territory and so forth is no longer how you expand your country's strength. You can take a coal mine, but frankly, that's not where the real wealth is these days. No one invading Silicon Valley could expect to be able to, in the same process, acquire the technological and entrepreneurial edge that is there. The thing is that the conflicts between nations and peoples and communities and even sometimes ideological blocs haven't gone away. So if they're not going to be fought out on the battlefield, they're being fought out on new battlefields. And this is really the essence of what the book is about. All the different ways in which nations try to impose their will on other nations, which is after all what war is all about. Sometimes it's in the so-called grey zone that Elizabeth writes so eloquently about. Different ways in which actually countries can directly sort of joust with each other. They can use overt and aggressive means, such as essentially, as I said, terrorism, use of criminality and such like. They can use what seem to be much, much less vicious ones, such as the disinformation, which Stewart has been such a scourge. But we should remember that even disinformation costs lives. Think of how many people, for example, believe nonsense about COVID vaccines and the like. These are less bloody wars, but these are not bloodless wars. But the point is now, in some ways, the most powerful military instrument now available is imagination. Countries, groups, peoples thinking about how can they, to put it bluntly, mess with other countries. Can they use culture? Can they use computer, sort of hacking in not just computer systems, but increasingly with Internet of Things, all of our gadgets that essentially frame us in our lives are now connected and therefore vulnerable. I mean, essentially, this is what war is all about now. It's about finding new ways of imposing countries' wills on others. And sometimes we won't even notice it's happening. This is the challenge. Sometimes exactly, not only is it undeclared, it'll be unnoticed, but bit by bit, maybe it's through economic suasion and corruption, we will find ourselves having, being pushed into other circumstances. And so the book is not saying this is dystopian. These are things that we can learn to use and live with ourselves. Nor is the book one of these classic sort of 10 steps to win the 21st century or anything like that. It's more about just simply saying, this is the way the world is going. We need to think about it. We need to be aware of it. We need to decide how we're going to use these new capabilities and how we're going to resist. I could, of course, go on, and indeed I have, for the length of this book, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Margoliotti, for your introductory remarks. And now I would like to ask Mr. Mcdonnell to give his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I think this is my first event with the Council on Geostrategy. A great pleasure it is to be here and to be joined by illustrious colleagues. Mark, who still in the short time I've been on the committee has been one of the outstanding witnesses we've had before the committee, and Elizabeth, who I've known for a few years now, and we've met in a number of different ways and done some good work together, and she's always kept me right when it comes to disinformation as well. So it's genuinely good to be here. I've got, funnily enough, I've got the book. I highly recommend buying it if you haven't already. But when I dug it out earlier, I came across Elizabeth's book, and I hope I wouldn't get around for showing it as well. I want to go into it's been mentioned, and I think the reason why I've been asked here this evening is to talk about disinformation, which is one of the areas I've focused on as my party's defence spokesperson, and focused on in the Foreign Affairs Committee as well. And I think the reason I chose to really focus on it and focus on it at a Scottish level is because our conversation on disinformation is just so unsophisticated. Probably sounds overly pompous, but it's certainly not where it needs to be, and it's certainly not where it needs to be in Scotland. And we kind of know that this problem exists. Occasionally you will read about it in the media, but there was never really a conversation starter about how this problem is presenting itself in different ways and what we can do about it, short of any major international treaties or agreements on this. And I'm not even sure how you compose those things. I think the best way of helping build up information resilience amongst our population is the best way of dealing with and countering disinformation. And my goodness, has the pandemic, as Mark mentions, not shown us the need for that. And what I tried to do in the report was split it into two sections. One, looking at how disinformation presents itself in Scotland from foreign actors, domestic actors. So that takes a look at some of the actions of Russia, some of the actions of Iran, China, in particular with Confucius Institutes, which Scotland has the highest per head. I think it's still the highest per head of population than anywhere in the world. There's a reason we got 2 pandas and nowhere else in the UK at the time did for Edinburgh Zoo. And really just assessing the activity of those countries. It's certainly not limited to those countries, largely in how, well, for Confucius Institutes, how it tries to distort debate on the sensitive discussions and topics that we all know are sensitive for them, but also how they try to, how the other countries try to interfere in our politics, and Russia in particular. I'm acutely aware that as the Scottish National Party that wants an independent Scotland, how we could be seen as an ideal platform for an actor like Russia to try and latch onto. I think we should be honest about that. Our cause is an entirely legitimate, noble one that's been around since the year 700 and something. What it doesn't need is infected by bad actors trying to cause trouble and further rancor where there needn't be any. I am quite proud that, and I'd like to take a wee bit of personal satisfaction in this, that the Sputnik offices in Edinburgh closed down in the last 18 months because they declared Scotland was too hostile an environment to operate in. But I tried to give an assessment of what is going on there. And then in the second part of the report, make some recommendations. And I worked with Elizabeth on this at the time on, what can we do to build up this information resilience? What does it actually look like? And without going through all 9 of the recommendations, if you go onto my website, you can read the report and the recommendations in full. I think what's needed, and I say this, it's needed at a UK level, it's needed at a Scottish level and elsewhere, is politicians to really engage in this across the board. This is, not just something that can be left to Whitehall. It's not just something that is a security or a defence issue. It touches every part of public life and public policy in different ways. And I had a really interesting call this morning, as it happens, with someone who worked as a counter disinformation consultant in the Welsh First Minister's office for a period of the pandemic. that is something that's now gone, and I think that's a mistake. I think that all parts of the state should be thinking about their role in helping counter disinformation, helping build up information resilience. How do we reach as many people as possible to ensure that they can consume information in a good and confident way? And in particular for politicians, how do we ensure that we're not spreading disinformation or misinformation as well? I think as figures in our constituencies and as national legislators, we have a particularly important role in that. Politicians will always spin, they will always, bullshit up to a point. But one of the things I think we're missing, and I'll throw this out there to end my remarks, is a proper working definition of what disinformation actually is. Because I think without that, without a kind of cross-society, cross-party agreement on what disinformation is, and I think all of us have got a good idea of what it constitutes and what it doesn't constitute, I think we end up falling into further rancor and divisions. We should have political arguments. I love them as much as the next person, but let's ensure the information space and the political space is as clean and as healthy as possible, and we're able to spot bad actors, but crucially ensure that we're not overcome with their attempts to, I hesitate to use the word infect, but distort perhaps our political debate so that we can have them with honesty and integrity. So I know that disinformation is only a small part of what Mark's book covers. It covers way more than that, and I look forward to the discussion on it. But again, I'll say, and I promise I'm not on commission, if you haven't yet bought it and read it, it's definitely worth your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. McDonald, for your speech. And now, Elizabeth Brough, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see Mark and Stewart on screen, and usually it's always a pleasure to see you in person, but this is a good runner-up, and congratulations on your book, Mark. And I think we'll all put a bookmark in the book, because I know I look forward to reading it, and I know I've heard Stewart is already enjoying reading it. So it occurred to me, I don't know how many have been watching the Canadian lorry driver protests, but it's really a spectacle to behold, and not in a positive sense. So Canadian lorry drivers are annoyed about COVID restrictions, were annoyed by COVID restrictions. And if you have a lorry, you have quite a significant power to block traffic, which is what a number of Canadian lorry drivers started doing on the bridge leading across the border from Canada to Detroit on the American side. And they started doing that, and then they were joined by others, and it became such an incredibly chaotic scene that did indeed block traffic and much else, that it became so chaotic that Justin Trudeau had to declare a state of emergency a couple of days ago. Really quite remarkable. It hasn't been done in recent memory, and this is clearly not a traditional emergency, a national emergency. It's some lorry drivers who were joined by others, and it's not a war. It's not even a pandemic. It's a citizen protest, but it illustrates how vulnerable our societies are, and that is the reason why it's so easy for governments that wish us harm to cause harm to our societies by crippling daily life. In the case of the Canadian lorry drivers, who knows how much foreign involvement there is, but if nothing else, they have demonstrated to all the hostile governments out there that working with lorry drivers might be a suitable way of causing mayhem in our societies. And indeed, those governments already know, as Stewart and Mark have already described, they already know, they're already intimately familiar with several other ways, many other ways in which to cause chaos in our societies. And we should remember that chaos goes from disinformation, which Stewart, to his credit, works so much on, and it ranges from that to cyber attacks, to corporate coercion, and everything else in between. And then when I was writing The Defender's Dilemma, the challenge that I constantly faced in trying to think about what we're going to do about it is that many of these means that are being used against us are not illegal. And people kept saying, well, what are you going to do about it? It doesn't break any laws. That is exactly the challenge. Cyber attacks, you can say under criminal law, that is really illegal. But disinformation, as long as it's not defamation, I have the right to say something that's incorrect, and I won't go to jail for it. So what do we do about that? And what do we do about corporate coercion and whatever else these other countries may think up? Today it's Russia, China, to a lesser extent, Iran and North Korea. In years ahead, it may be other countries, because countries are likely, government regimes are likely to decide that actually this is quite a convenient way of making your mark. And Belarus has clearly decided it's a convenient way of making your mark, and it's not costly in terms of money, and it's also not costly in terms of blood and lives lost. So that's where we are, and if we think about what our governments can do to counter it, there's really not very much they can do, because it's not clear when it's aggression and when it's just the hustle and bustle of daily life in the globalized world. And that's another challenge. When does gray zone aggression begin? Does it begin when somebody starts spreading rumors? Clearly not. But when is it gray zone aggression? When is it just an annoyance? Cyber attacks, when are they? Well, it's clear when they happen in most cases, but when do we respond, considering how long it takes to establish who's behind them? So, for example, today, and indeed yesterday, Ukraine experienced cyber attacks. The Ukrainian authorities think it may be Russia that's behind them, but it will take some time to establish beyond reasonable doubt, which is the measurement we use in liberal democracies. We don't just say, well, we think it was such and such. So it will take some time to investigate. And when that investigation has reached the point where Ukraine, or indeed any other attacked country, can say beyond reasonable doubt there was such and such country, then weeks and months have passed, and it will look a little bit silly if you say, well, regarding that cyber incident 3 months ago, we have established there was such and such country, now we're going to retaliate. So our governments are limited in a way they are not with traditional military attacks. They're limited in the ways in which they can respond, which leads me to the inevitable conclusion. I think it has to lead everybody to the inevitable conclusion that the big missing piece is societal resilience. It's not the only answer, but it's the bit behind the steely shield, which is the government, the armed forces, the complete set of tools available to our governments individually and collectively. Behind that, sort of as part of its combined shield, we have to have societal resilience, and that involves individual citizens, the totality of us as the population in any given country, and indeed the private sector, because without it, if governments in their individually with all the tools at their disposal, if they can't respond, and most importantly, if they can't signal to the other side that they will respond, then we are naked, because if they can't signal that and they don't have anything else to signal, then clearly the signal that's being sent to the other side, whatever side that might be, whether it's Russia, China, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, or any other country, the signal that will be sent is that go ahead and attack us, because we don't have the foggiest idea what to do. And that's where we are today. And clearly it's not news that this is happening, and some countries are trying to increase societal resilience, and indeed the National Preparedness Commission that you mentioned, Victoria, is one such effort, not a government effort, but an effort by a number of societal leaders, and I'm proud to be part of it. But it can't end there. It has to involve, it has to range from all the way from CEOs all the way to the lowest citizen. And if I may add on this note, Stewart has a fantastic competition that he launched for young people to be part of the counter disinformation effort, to contribute ideas. And Stewart, I'm sure you can tell everybody more about this competition, but this is a way to do it, not for us ordinary citizens to sit back and hope that somebody will solve it, for us all to feel that we are part of it, because nobody wants to live in a society that's constantly under threat and that's constantly well, it's inevitable that will be under threat, but that we don't want to live in societies that are constantly being disrupted by this, that, or the next tool. And so even if our contribution is simply as ordinary citizens, checking, verifying the information before sharing it, we'll be in a much better place. And on that note, just an example from yesterday, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, made some remarks regarding Ukraine, as is frequently being done these days. And they were translated by, well, somebody posted a Google translation on Twitter, which was then shared by many journalists. And that translation seemed to suggest that Scholz had said that Ukraine should forego the option of joining NATO. That was not the case, but people lazily shared it until it became such a trending Twitter subject that the German ambassador to the US and possibly other German ambassadors felt compelled to refute it. It was such an unnecessary incident. So it just illustrates once again how important the combined efforts of societal resilience are, in combination with the efforts of our governments.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And well, now we will open our Q&A session, but may I please ask everyone who asks the question, please indicate your role and affiliation, and if there's a particular person who you would like to address your question to. Let's start with the first question from Angus Lapsley, who is a diplomat at FCDO, and he would like to ask the following question. The UK and the US have gone on the offensive in the information war over Ukraine by preempting Russian moves with public exposure. How do you, Mark, Elizabeth, and Stewart think this has gone? Is it the right approach? Professor Galliotti, would you like to answer this first?
Surely. I mean, it's a really interesting strategy, precisely trying to kind of catch the Russians out by pointing out what the West knows or thinks it knows, and then drawing the fangs. So, for example, particularly in this notion of that there might be a false flag operation to create a pretext, by saying, we think the Russians are going to do this. If they then go ahead and do it, then it becomes much less sort of plausible. And I think it has value, but on the other hand, like all new tactics, it also carries risks with it. My concern is that as one apparent deadline, which often is not actually being presented by the Americans on the basis, but nonetheless, sort of people decide that, I mean, as today was meant to be, you know, the day when everything was going to happen. Was it 3 o'clock this morning or 1 o'clock this morning, depending on which cheap tabloid you read? As these days pass, and in some ways, as the strategy arguably is therefore successful, it becomes also easier for others to say, you see, this was actually disinformation. We see the Russians never intended to invade at all. It becomes one of these sort of Rorschach ink blot tests, whereby, you know, if you already are inclined to believe the government, then you will believe this is a successful strategy. If you are inclined to disbelieve the government, then you will think that this was all smoke and mirrors in the first place. So, I mean, I think it's a useful strategy because clearly the aim is not actually to influence public opinion. The aim is actually to try and prevent war. And in that respect, excellent. But again, what it really speaks to, and this is precisely the kind of things that Stewart and Elizabeth were both talking to, is that you can't just simply address the disinformation ecosphere, one specific lie, one specific crisis at a time. You need to address it much, much more broadly and much, much more systemically. So I said, the summary is, I think, an interesting strategy that actually has a lot of promise, but it also raises the point that we need to be much more aware of how we actually ensure that communities that are at the moment feeling that they're more inclined to believe some random individual on Twitter or some foreign government's TV channel, we need to address their skepticism also.
Thank you, Professor Galliotti. Elizabeth Brewer?
Mark put it perfectly. I would just add this when it comes to our communication and strategic communication vis-a-vis Russia or indeed other countries. It has, considering the limitations of the as described by Mark, I've often wondered whether we should try something completely different and instead reveal embarrassing secrets about the leaders who are trying to weaken our countries. And so if we think about, for example, there's enormous talk about in the UK, the properties owned by Russian leaders, not just by leaders, but by sort of mid-level officials and others and their families. And we all talk about who are they? And that information is not impossible to find. You just scour through the ownership records and various deeds and company's house and so forth. It's not that difficult. That is information that would embarrass Russian leaders and indeed the Russian elite with embarrass them in the eyes of the population. Unfortunately, Russia is not so closed, such a closed information environment that we aren't able to reach ordinary Russians. We are able to reach it in a way that we aren't able to reach ordinary Chinese or ordinary North Korean citizens. So why not use that? Why not when Russia is up to something that we consider destructive? Why not signal a bit of force and release some embarrassing facts and to indicate that if you pursue the plan that you're thinking of pursuing, we'll release much more of where this came from.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Mr. McDonald?
Yeah, I would agree with both Mark and Elizabeth on this. I mean, it's the point of it is to prevent war. And if it prevents further conflict, then it has been successful. But Mark is right; it does risk, further skepticism from the public. And I think perhaps where we could get better is the government explaining why they are doing it this way. I am naturally inclined to disbelieve the government, particularly this government, but I can understand entirely why they've chosen this strategy, and if it prevents war and further conflict, then good. But I do think that perhaps what needs to be considered is how do you take the public with you in understanding this. At the same time, I think it's partly, as Mark says, if we put hard dates on things, some people will say, well, it hasn't happened today. This proves it was all disinformation. I think this reinforces the need for a working definition on disinformation, but I think helping the public understand the strategy a bit more would be useful. But on Elizabeth's point about releasing embarrassing information or the sanctions and stuff, I'm sure most people tuning in this evening will have read Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic from a couple of days ago, and Edward Lucas, I think, in the Monday edition of the Times. We know who these people are. We know that their kids are at the fancy universities or have the big houses in someone else's name. I think it's time to sanction these people preemptively. I don't see why we need to wait for a further escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. And I guess my only criticism of the government's entire approach to this, and by the way, I have been supporting the government in the stances it's been taken, is that on the sanctions issue in particular, it could go further, it could go harder, and it could go a bit quicker. That's the only thing I'd like to see them perhaps do differently.
Thank you. The next question is from Dr. Thomas Maguire from Leiden University. Given many of the adversarial activities the speakers have outlined depend on operating deniability in the shadows, is there value in trying to consistently shine a light on these activities? For example, Free States exposing adversary actions with intelligence, or are there risks, downsides to doing this? Ms. Braw, would you like to?
Yeah, so this is where the public is a partner, right? So what has been tried so far, or what governments have preferred to do, is to shield the public from such information, because it's they don't want to cause panic, and they feel it would, they want to protect the public. The government's responsibility in national security is traditionally to protect the public and not cause alarm. But I wonder whether the time has come to treat the public more as a partner, even with the risk of causing a bit of anxiety by releasing at least some of the information about the threats that are being directed, not just threats, but forms of aggression, acts of aggression that are being directed against us. Because one of the challenges with gray zone aggression is that it's not always obvious, and obviously it's not always obvious, and in many cases it may seem like it's not happening. For example, if I walk down Whitehall and the sun is shining and nothing else is happening, I say, well, what is this crazy woman Elizabeth Broad talking about? Forms of aggression facing our society, and I feel perfectly safe. So if we are going to increase our resilience against these forms of aggression, it stands to reason that people should at least learn about them. And that, if I may flag up another publication free of charge, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency released in 2018 a lovely, a highly informative booklet called "If Crisis or War Comes." And at the time, people ridiculed it and called Sweden, alarmist and paranoid and so forth. This booklet is phenomenal. It has information about, how do you know that a crisis is happening? What do you do when power goes out? What sort of items should you always have at home? How do you identify disinformation? It's available in English and other languages as well. At the time, it was ridiculed. Then COVID arrived, and governments in other countries said, well, hang on, we haven't prepared the public, and now people are panicking. So I think it stands to reason that especially considering that people can read for themselves, and they will read for themselves on social media about various dangerous and shady things that are happening, why not have the government tell them, even at the risk of a little bit of anxiety being created? But it's better that they have that anxiety beforehand, or in a way that helps them prepare, as opposed to being faced with some sort of crisis situation and then panic.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald?
Yeah, this is actually, and again, if I can stick with disinformation, this is actually one of the recommendations I make in my report, is that in Parliament we have the regular, well, they're supposed to be regular, but they're often late, ministerial updates on countering Daesh. In my report, I say we should have an update, say, every 6 months, where a minister comes to Parliament to update Parliament and the public on the threat of disinformation. I think that would have been especially handy during the pandemic as well. Elizabeth's right, the public absolutely have to be a partner in this. And I think that we have to think about how we take the public with us on that. There are a whole range of ways that can be done. But I think crucially, if we're going to do this properly, and again, I'm sticking to disinformation, when you look at where responsibility for this lies across government, disinformation is largely MOD, misinformation is the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and then within those departments you have an array of differing agencies who have responsibility. You have Home Office involvement in some of that as well. That's before you get to other parts of the state and the public sector. It's such a complicated web of who is responsible for monitoring and countering this stuff that I think government just becomes too slow to respond to it. And that is understood by our adversaries and very much used to their advantage, I'm quite sure. So if we're going to kind of demystify this stuff, if we're going to take the public with us, I think shining a light on what is going on, yes, it carries risk, of course, but I think shining a light on what goes on and being very upfront about the nature of the threat that we face and ensuring the public understand that, I think that carries with it considerable considerable benefit.
Thank you. Professor Galeotti.
I mean, there's really not much to add, to be perfectly honest. The only thing I would talk about is briefly is to move this into that, there is a realm of deterrence theory. And broadly speaking, it comes down to two things. Deterrence by punishment. If you do something to me, I will do something bad to you, which, as we've heard, is actually often quite difficult in all this sort of non-kinetic and covert ways, because attribution can be difficult, takes time and so forth. Or there is deterrence by denial, which is it's not worth you doing this because it's going to fail and it's going to reflect badly on you. And I think this is in a way a missing part. We have a tendency to default to deterrence by punishment, which absolutely has its place. But actually deterrence by denial is really where we ought to be putting a lot more effort. And often that means being quite nimble and quite imaginative. And the example I would give is that when a team of Russian military intelligence officers were caught trying to hack into the systems of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, from a car park next door. The authorities, the Dutch authorities, obviously they did the immediate law enforcement counterintelligence thing. But then afterwards, I mean, the best thing was they treated it almost as a joke. I mean, they treated it seriously in the sense of the investigation and expulsions and such like. But in terms of their public messaging, they very much poked fun at these, rather incompetent Russians. And then they even had, there was an exhibition that was put on, which included the car that they'd been sort of operating out of the boot of and such like. Things like this were actually really, really quite inspired because it got under the skin of the people involved much more effectively. If you feel that if you fail, it will be an honorable failure, that's one thing. If you feel that precisely everything will be exposed, as for example, Bellingcat has done so effectively over cases like the Skripal poisoning and such like, that your face, your details will be revealed, and your foolishness is drawn to the attention of the world, and you will become an object of ridicule. Things like that. I mean, that's not in and of itself the panacea, but it's a kind of sense of how we should be thinking more imaginatively, because by God, we know that our antagonists are using all their imagination against us.
Thank you. Another question is from Chris McKeon from Press Association. Much of China's efforts to influence politics in the UK appears to be legal and more akin to lobbying than espionage. Is there anything we can do about this? Mr. McDonald.
Yeah, well, obviously we had the recent case in Parliament, which has, I think, focused a lot of minds. One of the things I would say, I was talking to someone in the Foreign Office about this last week. When, obviously, having Parliament as a place that is accessible and open to the public is immensely important. People should be able to walk into Parliament subject to the normal security and, take part in democratic discussion. One of the things I would say, and where we have a gap, and I've raised this and a number of colleagues have raised this, and it looks like it's going to start to get taken more seriously following the recent case that was in the press, is that when you become a new member of Parliament, nobody tells you how to look out for this stuff. I remember when I became an MP in 2015, and I mean, the first 6 months is like a bus hits you every single day and you wonder what the hell you've done with your life, but no one tells you if, when someone approaches you, for example, in Westminster Hall, where you don't need to be accompanied by anyone can wander into Westminster Hall, and you're approached by, someone purporting to represent an organization that sounds nice, the Campaign for Human Rights in X country or whatever, and it sounds nice and the kind of thing you would like to get involved in. No one tells you how to do proper due diligence on that, or who you can go to get that done in the parliamentary authorities, or can you go to the government? Who is the person we're meant to go and make sure that we're not entrapped meeting people or organizations, front organizations that we really don't want to be meeting with. So I think that for a start is one area in relation to the most recent case where we could be doing with really tidying that up. And I think also and I'm not sure if this is in line with your thinking, Chris, in terms of your question, we do need to look at these Confucius institutes. I am worried not just about what it means for free speech and free inquiry and academic inquiry and all the rest of it. I'm worried about the danger they present to people in these universities. I have met with students, and this is not unusual. I have met with students at Scottish universities who were involved in Hong Kong democracy protests in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, only to have their photographs snapped and sent back home to their families, where their families were told to, rein in your child, essentially. This is not good. And I think what we need, I think I'm right, Elizabeth, tell me if I'm wrong. I think Sweden is the only country that has actively closed down Confucius institutes. I think what we need, I would like to see them, or universities weaned off them, but I think what we need is a proper review of the role in universities across the UK, and crucially, a proper review of Chinese funding in universities across the UK as well. It was once said, and I get entirely why this was said, that perhaps Scotland can be seen as a backdoor into the UK because we have devolution of certain things such as education, healthcare, where previously we almost had Huawei involved in an NHS Scotland contract, Huawei involved in different universities. I think there needs to be better connectivity across government to ensure that we don't have backdoors, because national security issues are not a big issue for devolved governments. That's just the nature of the devolution settlement, and we really, really need it to be. And I say that as someone, with a certain constitutional outlook, but I want us all to be taking this seriously and getting it right.
Thank you. Professor Galliotti?
Yes, I think one of the interesting things about the whole saga of Chinese influence and penetration is precisely it is much more about influence. Obviously, it's worth saying they carry out the full spectrum of intelligence activities. They're very, very aggressive, particularly in terms of economic and industrial espionage and so forth. But putting that to one side, what we have seen is exactly that the Russians have sort of used the clumsy methods often. The Chinese, the much more subtle ones, lubricated on a thick film of money. And this is again, one of the issues that we need to address, is precisely the extent to which money can buy you access, money can buy you a voice. And in the case of, when one looks at the Huawei case, often what happens is money has a gravitic field all its own. Companies like Huawei often don't actually have to task people, but there will be a whole penumbra of other subcontractors, commercial partners, facilitators who work for them, who will be, in effect, lobbying to try and maintain a status quo that is convenient for them. So they don't actually have to be told. No one from Beijing has to ring them up. The same way as estate agents and bankers in the city are not being told, protect Russian oligarch money in the city. It's because this is where their bonuses come from. This is where their business rests. So I think that when we look at this, which we absolutely have to, and it's a very difficult one, because exactly where is the line between legitimate lobbying and illegitimate sort of influence on behalf of foreign powers? But when we look at that, we also have to make sure that we're not just simply saying foreign companies bad, domestic people good. That it's a much, much more complex, again, influence ecosystem. And again, this is why we need to be having that conversation. I wish I had some nice, neat answer. And it's not, because it's not just simply about lobbying and so forth. It's about all kinds of different ways of influence. But again, coming back to it, just as Stewart was saying about how we need a proper definition of disinformation, maybe we also actually need to have a proper conversation about the legitimate and appropriate forms of influence and the illegitimate ones too.
Thank you. Another question is from Thomas Klon, and he is asking which countries, especially in Europe, counter foreign disinformation effectively and which don't, and why? Ms. Braw.
The ones that counter disinformation most effectively, even though not even they are extremely effective, are the ones that involve wider society. So, for example, Finland is I think everybody's favorite pupil in this area. In fact, it's the teacher, because the Finnish curriculum has information literacy for very young children. And I mean, it seems so obvious, but other countries don't teach it. And some teachers are ambitious and teach their pupils critical thinking, but it's not part of the curriculum. And this is sort of the paradox of our modern societies. All we do all day is consume information, but especially those of us who are, let's say, older than 7 years old, we have never been taught how to verify information. So if I bet anything, if those of us, the 125 or so of us on this call, if we were given a test, the majority of us would fail it, simply because we haven't been taught how to verify information, how to spot disinformation, how to spot fakes, and of course it's going to get even more difficult to do that. Whereas as technology becomes more sophisticated, as it becomes easier to hide disinformation, including fake pictures. So Finland is a very good example. Then, of course, I should highlight the new Swedish Psychological Defense Agency, which is not a panacea, but nevertheless is a good effort, and has already highlighted in the 1.5 months since it was created a really nasty disinformation campaign being waged against the Swedish social authorities, where a couple of I think Syrian or Iraqi families claim that these Swedish authorities have kidnapped their children, and it's a really nasty disinformation campaign. Of course, feeds into the whole immigration debate. But what I wanted to highlight about this disinformation campaign is that it has been highlighted or further disseminated by established media, simply because their journalists, so including Al Jazeera, TRT World, simply because their journalists apparently didn't have the ability to spot the disinformation campaign either. So credit to the Finns for starting early, and let's hope other countries will try the same.
Thank you. The next question is from Jiri Schneider, who's the former Czech junior foreign minister. Weaponization of several non-military means like finance, energy, media information, etc., has been with us already for some time. It has also been often accused of improper securitization of everything. How would you argue against this false reversal of cause and effect? Professor Galliotti.
Jerzy, nice question. Good to hear from you. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a problem. And in some ways, I mean, actually, the title of my book, The Weaponization of Everything, I mean, on part, it was just simply a cheap gimmick to get people to buy it. But it was also, in some ways, precisely an ironic little sort of tilt at a tendency at the moment to precisely try and declare that everything is being weaponized from football hooliganism onwards. So there is a challenge, but again, I mean, at the risk of it becoming almost like a kind of banal leitmotif, I think a lot of this is precisely about having an open public debate about these issues. The problem is, I think there is still a tendency in too many governments to adopt an essentially paternalistic top-down approach. There is still this assumption that, you know, the boffins and the people in the government know best, and they will inform the public about what they need to worry about and what they don't need to worry about. And we're living in a very different age. We're living in an age in which a lot of these old kind of deferential structures are falling apart, and one in which everyone with a Twitter feed is in effect a media outlet in their own right. So in that context, this is exactly why we need to have that discussion and say that, you know, yes, of course, there will be debate. There will be differences of opinion. Of course, there will continue to be influence. How can we say, when is this an issue? We can't just simply securitize everything, because to securitize everything is to securitize nothing. Instead, we have to kind of, in some ways, almost reach national consensus about where the bounds of acceptable practice lie. And again, I think this is the point. I mean, it goes back to the point that both Elizabeth and Stewart made about the public being partners in this process. So I think that's how, and again, it's not quick and it's not easy. But that's how you address that particular critique, is by saying, look, we know that there are security risks. What we need to do is discuss what is important to us. What do we need to protect? What do we need to resist? And how do we want to do it? And that's something that everyone will be a part of.
Thank you. Well, relating to the comment you've just made, there's another question from Francis Tama, Honorary Professor at Exeter University. Stewart Mcdonnell referred to the necessity of building resilience within the counter-disinformation sphere. This is just one arena. What are the views about the UK's ability bringing together public and private organizations to provide joined-up and multi-domain strategy plans and activities? Mr. McDonald.
Yeah, all the notes I've been furiously writing down kind of go to answer this question, or at least I hope you think so. A couple of things I would say, just leading on from what Mark and Elizabeth have just said. Trust in institutions is really critical, and it's also really low at the moment. And I think government clearly has a role. Mark is right. Government doesn't always know best, and the idea that government could devise a counter disinformation strategy and that they alone would be best placed to implement that across the land, I think would fall at the first hurdle. But it does have a role in devising a strategy, so long as the public are involved in that from the word go. And one institution in particular that I think is really important is the media. Trust in the media is low at the minute as well. And one of the things, and Elizabeth wrote a paper on this previously, I think a few years back, is one of the things we need to do is demystify the media and how news is gathered and made, how a story is written. Trust in doctors and nurses is very, very high because everyone has met a nurse and a doctor probably more than once across their adult life. Hardly anyone knows a journalist. And so I think if we can find ways of getting that interaction, hardly anyone's met a member of parliament. That's why most people don't trust or like us as well. But if we can find ways of getting people to, getting news organizations to open their doors a bit to the public, I think that can help us building up that resilience and demystifying, that particular institution. I think the private sector's got an immensely important part to play in that, as have big membership organizations. People, you think of how many people are members of trade unions who work in the public sector, are in political parties, for example, are in members of religious organizations. How do we bring all these parts of our society in to reach people that, frankly, the boffins in Whitehall and even the members of parliament in Westminster just won't reach? So I think if we had a really clever, sophisticated strategy that was as wide and all-encompassing as possible, we could do something really, really interesting. And I think the last thing I would say is, there are many, and I'm sure we've all been to them, many kind of ad hoc summits and workshops and all kinds of things. In fact, my last trip before the pandemic was to Washington, to the Wilson Center, to talk about disinformation for a few days. There are loads of these things that happen. But I do wonder if, and Finland, as Elizabeth rightly says, is a real leader, but I do wonder if what we need is for governments to host an annual, clean information summit. It's one of the things in my report where we can come together as, different governments, as well as the think tank community and all the rest of it, and share best practice, learn from each other, devise new strategies, much in the same way we do for lots of other things as well. So I think that, yes, be clever, be smart, be sophisticated, go as wide and as deep into society as possible, on the understanding that government has a role, but it's not always the role it thinks it has is the best one.
Thank you so much, Mr. McDonald. I know that Mr. McDonald has to leave us sharp at 7 p.m., but I still would like to ask the final question. You, Professor Margoliotti, in your book, you indicate that rather than wish for a return to a bygone era of stable warfare, you detail ways of taking advantage of the opportunities presented by our new reality. Could you please shed some light? What do you mean by that, and what we can find in your book?
Sure. I mean, there always has to be, like Pandora's box, there are hope at the bottom after you've talked about all the bad stuff that is around. And I think the thing is, I think we often fall prey to a counsel of despair. That we look at all these things coming to us, and relatively nimble or otherwise insurgent and asymmetric challenges from whether it's Russia or China or Iran or North Korea or wherever. And we think, oh, how can we possibly respond? And we forget the fact that we have astonishing capabilities in the West. It's not just about our assembled aggregate economic power. It's also about the technological edge. It's about the soft power. Very few countries are full of people who are saying, if only my country was a bit more like the Russian Federation. It's also about our capacity to, again, in some ways, to go back to the point that Stewart made. I mean, actually, we do cooperate and collaborate and not just share best practice, but actually look after each other and protect each other. I think what we need to do is move away from a world in which we thought that basically we were already the ones who were the dominant and great power. And we got, to be perfectly honest, complacent, fat and lazy. Says someone who is himself vaguely complacent, fat and lazy. And instead, we need to be thinking in those much more, I think, imaginative terms. How can we mobilize and marshal what we have? I'm not saying that we should be out there in the disinformation game, for example. I mean, that is a fool's game. We cannot win that. We can just simply drag everyone down to the same level. But on the other hand, whether it's in terms of, yes, spreading information that we know about corrupt kleptocrats, whether it's in terms of actually being much, much more direct about how we can sort of mobilize things like aid and economic assistance to ensure the effects we would like to see. But I think that we have really, since we won the Cold War, we sat back and thought precisely, we won the Cold War, everything is fine, rather than being aware of the fact that we need to be thinking about the next challenge, not just simply resting on our laurels. So, I mean, that's a very broad answer because it's impossible to actually give a specific one. We need to look at the particular challenges. But the main thing is that we must realize actually that we should not lose confidence in ourselves. Because in many ways, if one looks, for example, at what Putin is doing currently on the Ukrainian border, it's precisely to give that sense. This is a man who is so ruthless, so together, so powerful, that all we can do is try and find a way of buying him off. We mustn't fall prey to that kind of dark power. Instead, we must think, well, we're not that badly off ourselves.
Thank you, Professor Margoliotti. I would like to sincerely thank all our panelists and attendees for joining us tonight. It's already 7 p.m. and unfortunately our event has come to an end. But I also have some fantastic news. Our Policy Relations and Events Coordinator, John Dobson, will be sending out an email straight after this event with information on Professor Galiotti's book, and luckily with a discount code included to all attendees, so you can get a copy of this wonderful book yourself tonight. Thank you so much once again, and we will be bringing many more timely and important discussions on geostrategic challenges and environmental security matters in the upcoming weeks and months. You can check the upcoming events on our website, www.geostrategy.org.uk/events, and you can subscribe to our events on our website as well. Thank you so much once again for joining us tonight, and goodbye.